Some humiliations are designed to break you in front of everyone who matters. The kind that strips away dignity piece by piece while spectators watch and whisper and do nothing to stop it. For Lyra, that moment came during the spring equinox court, when she was called before hundreds of nobles to answer for a crime she didn't commit, and Lady Margot used the opportunity to systematically destroy her reputation with lies so polished they sounded like truth. The accusations came fast and brutal: theft of jewelry, inappropriate conduct with guards, laziness, disrespect. Each one carefully crafted to paint a picture of a servant who didn't deserve her position, let alone basic human dignity. Lyra stood there in her plain uniform, hands shaking, unable to defend herself against someone with money and title and 3 decades of practice at court manipulation. The nobles laughed. They always laughed when someone beneath them was being torn apart. It was entertainment.
Watching the powerless squirm, and Lyra felt something inside her start to crack under the weight of injustice and audience cruelty. Then, King Theon, who'd been sitting on his throne with an expression of bored patience, stood up, walked down the dais steps, crossed the marble floor, and took Lyra's trembling hand in his own. The laughter died like someone had cut its throat. Lyra had been a servant in the Whale Palace for 3 years, working in the East Wing where guest quarters required constant attention. She wasn't nobility or even merchant class. Her mother had been a seamstress who died when Lyra was 12. Her father was a stable hand at a minor lord's estate who drank himself to death 2 years later. Lyra ended up in an orphanage that was more prison than sanctuary, and she escaped at 16 by securing a servant position through sheer determination and a forged reference letter. The palace was better than the orphanage, but not by much.
Servants were invisible unless they made mistakes. They worked 14-hour days for wages barely sufficient for food and shared dormitory space. They had no protections against noble cruelty, no recourse when treated unfairly. But it was stable employment, and Lyra was good at being invisible. She cleaned thoroughly, never complained, kept her head down and her mouth shut. For 3 years, this strategy worked. She wasn't happy, but she was surviving. Then Lady Margot arrived for an extended court visit. Margot was a duchess from the southern provinces with a reputation for extravagance and entitlement. She brought 17 trunks of clothing, 4 personal maids, and an attitude that treated palace servants like furniture. Lyra was assigned to her guest suite, and the problems started immediately. Nothing was good enough. The sheets weren't pressed properly. The water wasn't hot enough. The flowers in the vase were wilting. Every task became an opportunity for criticism. And Margot's personal maids made it worse by undoing Lyra's work and blaming her for the mess. It was systematic bullying, and Lyra endured it because what choice did she have? But then came the incident with the necklace. Margot's sapphire necklace went missing from her jewelry box. She immediately accused Lyra, who'd been the only palace servant with access to the room. Never mind that Margot's personal maids had unrestricted access. Never mind that the security protocols meant Lyra's movements were logged, and she'd been in the room for exactly 8 minutes that morning. Margot wanted a scapegoat, and Lyra was convenient. The head of household tried to investigate quietly, but Margot escalated to court officials, demanding public accountability, which meant Lyra standing before the spring equinox court while Margot laid out her accusations with practiced drama. The throne room was packed with nobility in their finest clothes, there for ceremony and social positioning. Lyra stood in the center in her faded uniform, a piece of set decoration for their entertainment. Lady Margot paced like a prosecutor, her voice carrying to every corner. This girl was entrusted with my private chambers. I welcomed her service with kindness and patience, despite her obvious inadequacies. And how was I repaid? Theft. My grandmother's sapphire necklace, worth more than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes, stolen while I attended morning prayers. When confronted, she showed no remorse, no accountability,
just sullen silence and disrespect. It was masterful fiction. Lyra had never been confronted about anything because the necklace hadn't been missing when she'd been in the room. The whole thing was a setup, but her word meant nothing against a duchess. Lord Pembroke, one of Margot's allies, stood to add his voice. This is exactly the problem with hiring servants from questionable backgrounds. No references, no family reputation, no reason to expect integrity.
The palace has been too lenient. We need stricter vetting and harsher punishments. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the nobles. Lyra felt the walls closing in. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but her voice came out as a whisper nobody heard over the crowd's noise. Lady Seraphina, the king's chief advisor, called for order. The girl will be dismissed and banned from palace service. The necklace's value will be deducted from final wages, leaving her with nothing. She should be grateful we're not pursuing criminal charges. Lyra's knees nearly gave out. Dismissed meant no references, no future employment, back to the streets with nothing. She'd survive maybe a week before desperation drove her to choices she couldn't come back from. This was a death sentence delivered with legal precision. She looked up at the throne where King Theon sat, the Beast King who everyone said was cold and distant and unconcerned with servant problems. She didn't expect help.
She just wanted one person to see that this was wrong. Their eyes met, and something shifted in his expression. Theon had been king for 3 centuries and attended more court sessions than he could count. Most were tedious exercises in noble posturing. He'd learned to tune them out, handle the necessary decisions, and let his mind wander during the theatrical parts. He'd been doing exactly that during Margot's accusation, until he actually looked at the girl being condemned. Really looked. She was young, maybe 20, with the kind of exhaustion that came from years of hard labor and no hope. Her uniform was clean but worn thin from washing. Her hands were red and cracked from harsh cleaning solutions, and her eyes, when they met his, held no defiance or guilt, just bone-deep weariness and acceptance of injustice. Something about that acceptance triggered a memory. He'd known someone once, centuries ago, who'd had that same look, a servant falsely accused by nobility,
Condemned without real investigation, destroyed by a system that valued title over truth. Theon had been younger then, less powerful, unable to stop it. That person had died in poverty, and their innocence had been proven too late to matter. He'd carried that guilt for 200 years. He wasn't going to carry another. Theon stood, and the room went silent, because the king rarely moved during court sessions unless something serious was happening. He descended the dais steps with measured purpose, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Margot smiled triumphantly, assuming he was coming to personally condemn the girl. The nobles watched with anticipation, expecting entertainment. Lyra just stood there, too tired to even hope. Theon stopped directly in front of her, looked down at this exhausted servant who'd been systematically destroyed for someone else's amusement. Then he did something that would be talked about for decades. He took her hand. Not roughly, not as a gesture of arrest or judgment, gently, as an equal offering support. The throne room's silence became absolute. Theon's voice, when he spoke, carried authority that made nobles straighten instinctively. This court session is suspended. Lady Margot, you will return to your quarters and remain there. Lord Pembroke, you will accompany Lady Seraphina to retrieve the guest quarter security logs. This girl will be treated as my personal guest until this matter is properly investigated. Anyone who objects can bring their concerns directly to me, privately. Nobody objected. Margot's face went white. Pembroke looked like he'd been slapped. The nobles who'd been laughing minutes ago suddenly found the floor very interesting. Theon kept Lyra's hand in his and addressed her directly. "What's your name?" "Lyra, Your Majesty." She could barely get the words out. "Come with me, Lyra. We're going to sort this out properly." He led her out of the throne room, still holding her hand, leaving behind a court full of stunned silence and frantic whispers. They walked through corridors where servants pressed against walls, staring in shock. Kings didn't hold servants' hands. Kings didn't personally intervene in staff disputes. This was unprecedented, and everyone knew it.
Theon brought her to his private study, a comfortable room lined with books that smelled of leather and old paper. He released her hand and gestured to a chair. "Sit. Eat." He indicated a tray of food that had been prepared for his lunch. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." Lyra's mind couldn't process what was happening. "Your Majesty, I don't understand. You were being railroaded by someone with power and no conscience. I've seen it before. I won't watch it happen again without doing something about it." "But why? I'm nobody. You're a person being treated unjustly. That's reason enough. Now eat while I handle this." He pulled out a communication device and started issuing orders. Within an hour, he had the complete picture. Security logs showed Lyra's movements exactly as she'd claimed. Guest quarter staff confirmed Margot's personal maids have been in the room unsupervised for over an hour after Lyra left. And most damningly, a search of Margot's maids' belongings turned up the supposedly stolen necklace, deliberately hidden to frame Lyra. The whole thing had been an elaborate scheme because Margot enjoyed cruelty and thought she could get away with it. Theon reviewed the evidence with cold fury. Then he returned to the throne room, where Margot and the court were still assembled, required to remain until the king returned. Lyra followed, terrified, but also hopeful for the first time in weeks. The evidence was presented publicly: the security logs, the staff testimony, the recovered necklace from Margot's own maid's possession. Each piece of proof hit like a hammer blow, and Margot's carefully constructed story collapsed into obvious fiction. The nobles who'd laughed at Lyra's humiliation now avoided eye contact, ashamed or perhaps just afraid of royal displeasure. Theon's voice was ice. "Lady Margot, you deliberately falsified accusations to destroy an innocent person's life for your entertainment. Your personal staff participated in theft and conspiracy. This behavior is not only unacceptable, it violates the basic principles of justice this court is supposed to represent." Margot tried to salvage the situation. "Your Majesty, there's been a misunderstanding. My maids acted without my knowledge. I was genuinely concerned about the necklace." Theon cut her off. "Your maids have already confessed to following your explicit orders. Don't compound your crimes with more lies. Here is your sentence. You are stripped of your guest status and banned from this palace permanently. Your estates will be audited for evidence of similar behavior toward your own staff. If we find a pattern, which I suspect we will, you'll face additional consequences. As for your maids who participated, they're dismissed without references. Leave within the hour." Margot's face went from white to crimson. "You can't do this to me. I have connections. I have power." "You had power, past tense. Now you have an escort to ensure you leave quietly." Guards appeared to fulfill that purpose. Margot was removed, still protesting, to the satisfaction of probably every servant who'd ever dealt with her. Theon then addressed the court. "Let this be clear. Anyone in this palace, noble or servant, who abuses their position to harm others will face consequences. I don't care about your title or your connections. Justice applies equally, or it means nothing. This court is dismissed." The nobles dispersed quickly, nobody wanting to linger and risk royal attention. Theon turned to Lyra, who was standing there in shock, trying to process that she'd just been vindicated publicly. "You're reinstated, with full pay for the time you lost. You'll also receive compensation for the harm done to your reputation, and I'm reassigning you to direct palace service, which comes with better pay and protections. If anyone gives you trouble, you report to me personally." She felt tears burn. "Why are you doing this? I'm just a servant." "Because you're a person who deserved better than what happened, and because I'm tired of watching people with power abuse it while everyone else pretends not to notice. Someone has to actually do something about it." Lyra wiped her eyes roughly. "Thank you doesn't feel like enough. Then prove it by being excellent at your work and not letting this break you. That's thanks enough." The aftermath rippled through the palace like a stone in still water. Servants walked taller, knowing they had royal backing against abuse. Nobles were more careful, understanding that title didn't grant immunity from consequences. And Lyra found herself in a completely different position than she'd occupied that morning. Her new role was in the king's household staff, working directly under the head steward.
Better hours, better pay, better treatment. But more than that, she had the king's visible support, and that changed everything. People treated her with respect, not out of fear, but because Theon had made it clear she mattered. The other servants, initially wary, welcomed her once they realized she wasn't putting on airs despite the king's favor. She was still Lyra, still worked as hard as anyone, still ate in the common dining hall and shared dormitory space. The only difference was confidence. She'd been publicly humiliated and then publicly vindicated, and that combination forged something strong in her that hadn't existed before. Theon checked on her regularly, not as a king monitoring an employee, but as someone genuinely invested in her well-being. They talked during his evening walks through the palace, casual conversations that started about work and expanded to everything else. She told him about growing up in the orphanage, and he told her about the loneliness of immortal rule. She asked him about policy decisions, and he valued her perspective as someone who understood what life was like for common people. Slowly, over months, friendship developed, the kind built on mutual respect and genuine interest rather than hierarchy. The court noticed, of course. Court always noticed. Rumors started that Lyra was the king's mistress because nobility couldn't imagine a king being friends with a servant without ulterior motives. Lady Seraphina addressed it during a council meeting. "Your Majesty, the relationship with the servant girl is causing speculation. Perhaps some distance would be appropriate." Theon's response was flat. "My friendship with Lyra is nobody's business but ours. The fact that court can't conceive of a king respecting a servant as an equal says more about court than about us. The speculation can continue. I don't care." But Lyra cared. She pulled him aside after overhearing servants discussing the rumors. "This is hurting your reputation. Maybe I should request a transfer to a different section so we don't see each other as much." His expression hardened. "Is that what you want?" "No, but I don't want to cause problems for you either." "Then don't. My reputation has survived 3 centuries of challenges. It'll survive people gossiping about who I choose as friends, unless you're uncomfortable with the attention, in which case I'll respect that." She thought about it, about the years of being invisible, of accepting mistreatment, because that's what servants did, about the king who'd taken her hand in front of everyone and changed everything. "I'm not uncomfortable. I just wanted to make sure you knew what you were choosing. I know exactly what I'm choosing. A friend who sees me as a person, not a crown. That's rarer than you'd think. Keep showing up, Lyra. That's all I ask." 2 years into their friendship, Theon made a decision that shocked the kingdom. He created a new position, advocate for common citizens, and appointed Lyra to fill it. The role's purpose was to ensure common people had representation in policy discussions, to bring real-world perspective to court decisions, to act as a bridge between the crown and those it governed. Lyra would attend council meetings, review proposed policies for impact on working people, and report directly to the king. The council exploded. "This is madness," Lord Pembroke protested. "A servant in council meetings, advising on policy? She has no training, no education in governance." "She has lived experience you lack," Theon countered. "She knows what it's like to work 14-hour days for barely enough to survive. She understands how policies that sound good in theory affect people in practice. That's training none of you have." Lady Seraphina, always more practical than ideological, asked the real question: will she actually have authority? Or is this ceremonial? Real authority. Her recommendations carry weight. If she says a proposed policy will harm common citizens, we revise it. That's the point. Over the protests, Theon made it official. Lyra went from servant to advisor, and the kingdom watched to see if this unprecedented appointment would be disaster or revolution. It was revolution. Lyra brought perspectives that transformed policy discussions. When the council proposed increased trade taxes, she explained how they devastate small merchants. When they debated education funding, she described what schools in poor districts actually needed versus what nobles thought they needed. When they discussed food security, she talked about what it felt like to go hungry, not as abstract concept, but as lived reality. The council learned to listen because her insights prevented policies that would have caused real harm while looking good on paper. Slowly, grudgingly, they came to respect her.
Not because of her title, but because she was consistently, undeniably right about how decisions would affect the majority of people they governed. And Lyra thrived. Years of invisibility had taught her to observe and understand people. Now she had a platform to use that understanding constructively. She established programs to improve working conditions, created legal protections for servants against noble abuse, built infrastructure in underserved districts. Every initiative was rooted in real need, rather than theoretical good intentions. 5 years after the spring equinox court where she'd been publicly humiliated, Lyra was one of the most influential advisors in the kingdom, not through title or birth, but through competence and the king's absolute support. The 10th anniversary of that day arrived during another spring equinox court. This one was different. Lyra attended as advocate, seated at the council table rather than standing in the center being condemned. Theon called for a moment of recognition. 10 years ago in this room, we witnessed a profound injustice. A servant was falsely accused and publicly humiliated, while this court laughed and did nothing. That moment taught me something crucial, that power without accountability is tyranny, that titles without integrity are meaningless, that the measure of a society is how it treats those with the least power, not how it honors those with the most. He looked directly at Lyra. That servant became one of my closest advisors and most trusted friends. She's improved more lives through her work than most nobles accomplish in lifetimes. And she did it not because of where she started, but because of who she chose to be when given the chance. That's what we should be celebrating. Not birth or title, character and contribution. The court applauded, genuine this time, because even the most cynical nobles had to acknowledge Lyra's impact. After the session, Lyra and Theon walked through the palace gardens as they often did. She was quiet, processing emotions she couldn't quite name. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked finally. "If you hadn't taken my hand that day?" "All the time. You'd have been destroyed by that injustice. I'd have let it happen through inaction. Both of us would have been lesser for it." He stopped walking and faced her. "Here's what I've learned, Lyra. The moments that define us aren't the grand planned decisions. They're the small choices when we see something wrong and decide whether to act. I chose to act that day, not because I had a plan, but because I couldn't watch another innocent person be destroyed. Everything else followed from that choice." She smiled, tears threatening. "You changed my entire life by taking my hand." He smiled back. "You changed mine by being worth that gesture, by proving that courage and integrity have nothing to do with birth status, by becoming the friend and advisor I didn't know I needed. That's why moments matter." They smiled at each other in the spring sunlight, two people whose lives had intersected at the worst moment and created something extraordinary from injustice. The servant who'd been mocked became the voice for millions. The king who'd been distant became accessible. And together they proved that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is see someone's worth when everyone else is too busy laughing to notice. If this story reminded you that one person standing up can change everything, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Drop a comment with the word moon if you believe real power comes from lifting others up, not keeping them down. Share this video with someone who needs to know that their worst moment might be the doorway to their best future. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see you when everyone else looks away. Thanks for watching, and remember, the hand you extend today might change someone's entire world tomorrow.